The morning air had a crispness to it, the kind that reminded you autumn was peeking just around the corner. Zariah Monroe, a poised 15-year-old black girl, stepped off the city bus with a kind of quiet determination most adults would envy. Dressed in her school uniform, a navy blazer, white blouse, plaid skirt, and well-worn loafers, she held a leather folder close to her chest as if it were a treasure map. In many ways, it was. Inside the folder sat a $5,000 scholarship check, an award she had earned through sheer determination and long nights of study. It represented more than money. It was a symbol of who she was and who she aspired to be. As the sliding glass doors of Rockwell First Bank opened before her, Zariah took a steadying breath. This wasn't just a visit to make a deposit. This was a rite of passage. The bank, elegant and hushed, gave off an air of quiet authority. Marble floors gleamed underfoot, and the scent of expensive furniture polish lingered in the air. A chandelier above sparkled with old-world charm. It was the kind of place where people wore cufflinks, where voices stayed low and transactions remained private. Despite her nerves, Zariah walked tall. Her mother, Dr. Simone Monroe, had always told her, "When you walk into a room, you belong there whether they realize it or not." She approached the teller line with a shy but polite good morning, carefully setting her folder on the polished counter. Her palms were slightly damp, not from fear, but from the magnitude of the moment. This was her first time handling something like this without her mother by her side. Simone had offered to come, of course, but Zariah had insisted. "I've got this, Mom. I want to do it myself." Unbeknownst to her, across the lobby, a woman in a sharp gray suit was watching her. Sharon Whitaker, the bank's long-standing branch manager, narrowed her eyes behind tortoiseshell glasses. She took in the sight of Zariah, young, black, and alone, and her smile tightened into something far less welcoming. At that moment, Zariah couldn't possibly know what awaited her. She didn't see the judgment forming. She didn't hear the whispers or feel the suspicions thickening like storm clouds. To her, this was a simple errand. In reality, it was the first step into a storm that would test everything she believed about fairness, identity, and justice. She had walked into Rockwell First Bank hoping to prove something to herself. What she didn't expect was that she'd end up uncovering something far bigger, a secret that could unravel more than just her deposit but a corporate betrayal tied to her own family. If you're still with us, we're just getting started. Drop a 7 in the comments if you want to see what happens in the dramatic climax that left the entire bank stunned. This isn't just about money. It's about dignity. And the moment Zariah realized she wasn't just a girl with a check, she was the beginning of a reckoning. Stay tuned. The truth is coming. Zariah stood at the teller counter, her folder now open before her, exposing the neatly clipped $5,000 scholarship check and the official award letter from the Westridge Scholars Program. She had triple-checked the paperwork before leaving home. Her mother had taught her to be prepared. "Always have your facts in order," Simone often said, "and no one can shake you." But now, as the teller reached for the check, Zariah's confidence began to falter. The teller, a young man with sandy blonde hair and a stiff blue tie, glanced down at her name, then up at her face. His name tag read Ethan Mallory, but his expression read something else, uncertainty. He didn't smile, didn't say congratulations, didn't acknowledge the effort it took to earn a scholarship at 15. Instead, he narrowed his eyes and held the check up to the light as if it were suspicious on its face. Zariah forced a polite smile, trying to stay calm. She had seen people do this before, hold checks to the light, but this felt different. Ethan took a little too long, she thought. He flipped it over, held it again, then leaned slightly toward her. "And where exactly did you get this?" he asked, his tone clipped. Zariah blinked. "It's from the Westridge Scholars Program. I won a full academic scholarship." "The letter's right there," she said, gesturing to the typed document bearing the school's letterhead and embossed seal. "And that's my student ID." But Ethan was no longer looking at her documents. Instead, he was looking over his shoulder, motioning to someone across the room. From the corner of her eye, Zariah saw the manager, Sharon Whitaker, break off from a conversation and walk toward them. dressed immaculately in a pinstriped suit with a silver nameplate on her lapel. Sharon walked like someone who believed every room belonged to her. Her heels clicked across the marble like punctuation marks echoing with authority. She didn't greet Zariah, didn't ask her name, didn't so much as glance at the documents spread on the counter. Instead, she gave Ethan a curt nod and turned her gaze directly on the check. "We've had an uptick in fraud lately," she said loud enough for nearby customers to hear. "We have to be especially careful with unusual deposits." Zariah's chest tightened. "It's not fraudulent," she said softly, suddenly hyper-aware of how quiet the bank had become. "I can show you the email confirmation. My phone is at school, but I have everything here." Sharon didn't respond to the explanation. Instead, she motioned to Ethan again, then turned her cold eyes back to Zariah. "We'll need to verify this. Please step aside and wait." There was no smile, no courtesy, not even the thin veil of polite customer service. Zariah hesitated, unsure if she was supposed to say something more, or if saying anything would only make it worse. Slowly, she gathered her folder, stepped away from the counter, and stood beside a potted ficus near the lobby's edge. A few customers glanced in her direction. One woman frowned. Another man looked her up and down before returning to his paperwork. The air in the room had shifted. Zariah felt it. A tension she couldn't name but knew too well. She wasn't being treated like a scholar or a customer. She was being treated like a problem. And for the first time that morning, a chilling thought crept into her mind. Maybe this wasn't just about a check. Maybe it was about her. Minutes passed, then more. Zariah stood by the ficus plant as instructed, her hands still gripping the edges of her folder like it was a shield. The polished floor beneath her feet felt colder now, less like marble and more like ice. She tried to look composed, but the tremble in her fingers betrayed her. Around her, life in the bank continued, calm, ordered, and entirely unaware of the storm building inside her. She watched as a well-dressed elderly white couple entered through the brass-handled doors. Instantly, Sharon Whitaker stepped forward to greet them, her voice warm and sweet like a morning radio host. "Mr. and Mrs. Hawthorne, always a pleasure," she gushed. Without asking for identification, without even glancing at paperwork, she personally escorted them to a private consultation room, her laughter trailing behind her like perfume. Zariah stood a little straighter, forcing herself not to react. She looked down at the folder still clutched in her arms. The award letter, the check, the ID, all legitimate, all ignored. She could feel eyes brushing against her like gusts of wind, some filled with curiosity, others coated in pity or quiet judgment. Whispers fluttered between customers behind her. The kind that pretended not to exist yet said everything loud enough. Then came the security guard. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in the dark blue uniform of authority. He took a position nearby without a word. Not near the teller stations, not near the vault, near her. Zariah's eyes met his briefly. He looked away. She swallowed hard. From her position, she watched as another customer approached the counter. A young man with a thick accent and a folder of documents. He barely finished explaining his request before Sharon, still nearby, interrupted with a dismissive wave. "The system's running slow," she said sharply, not bothering to look at him again. The man hesitated, nodded silently, and stepped aside. Barely a minute later, a white couple entered with similar documents in hand. This time, Sharon beamed. "Of course, right this way," she said, ushering them ahead of the waiting line. "We'll take good care of you." That was when it hit Zariah, not as a sudden blow but as something far worse. A slow-burning realization. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't caution. This wasn't policy. It was discrimination. Dressed in designer heels and wrapped in professionalism, Zariah felt heat rise to her cheeks. Not just from embarrassment, but from anger. Still, she didn't move. She didn't flinch. Her mother had always told her, "Grace is power. When they try to reduce you, rise taller." So she stood tall. But inside, her heart raced. No one had yelled at her. No one had insulted her out loud. Yet everything about how she'd been treated, The delay, the doubt, the distance, screamed that she was being viewed as less trustworthy, less deserving, less welcome. And still, not a single person had asked her a real question. Not about her check, not about her day, not even about her name. A banker's voice called for the next customer. Not her. The silence pressed in. In that moment, Zariah understood what her textbooks couldn't fully explain. How racism didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered. Sometimes it smiled. Sometimes it simply pretended you weren't there at all. She took a slow, steady breath, but her resolve didn't waver. Not yet. The quiet hum of printers and muffled footsteps filled the air as Zariah continued to wait by the wall, her back straight and her eyes alert. Time had lost its shape. 5 minutes felt like 50. Her phone remained locked in her school locker. It might as well have been on the moon. She couldn't call her mother. She couldn't even leave. All she could do was stand, watch, and wait. But Zariah wasn't just waiting. She was watching. Though ignored by the bank staff, she saw everything. She saw the way Sharon laughed with certain customers. How she only frowned when speaking to others who looked more like Zariah. She noted how Ethan, the teller, avoided eye contact when he passed by her station. And she saw, out of the corner of her eye, something strange. Something that made her stomach twist. Sharon Whitaker was no longer behind the counter. Instead, she stood near a conference room at the back of the bank, speaking in hushed tones to a tall, sharply dressed man. He wore a tailored navy suit, a platinum tie pin, and confidence like a second skin. His salt and pepper hair was combed neatly back, and he exuded the polished charm of someone used to being listened to. Zariah squinted, trying to place his face. Then it clicked. She had seen him once in a magazine her mother had brought home. Victor Klein, CEO of Eastbridge Holdings, a direct rival to Monroe Capital Partners, the firm run by Zariah's mother, Dr. Simone Monroe. She remembered the way her mother's jaw had tightened when his name came up in conversation. He plays dirty, her mom had said once, almost offhandedly during a late-night business call. Wouldn't hesitate to cut corners or throats. Now, here he was in her mother's bank, talking to Sharon Whitaker. Zariah leaned slightly to the side to get a better view. She hoped the ficus plant provided just enough cover. Sharon was holding something, a manila folder thick and creased at the edges. She handed it to Victor with quick, secretive gestures. He flipped it open, skimming its contents. Zariah's heart skipped. From her angle, she could just make out the edge of a logo printed on the top sheet. The swirling blue and silver emblem of Monroe Capital Partners, her mother's company. She blinked, unsure if her eyes had deceived her. But then Victor nodded, tucked the folder beneath his arm, and offered a satisfied, practiced smile. Sharon smiled back, but not the way she smiled at customers. No, this one was different, colder, calculating, complicit. Zariah's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't just being ignored. She was being hidden, pushed aside, and not just because of the check or her skin or her age. There was something bigger going on. Something she had stumbled into without even knowing it. She had walked into a bank to make a deposit, but she had uncovered a betrayal. Zariah pressed her back harder against the wall, her hands tightening around the edges of her folder. She reached into her backpack and pulled out her leather-bound notebook, the one her mother had given her as a gift at the beginning of the school year. For ideas, thoughts, and truth, Simone had written on the first page. With trembling fingers, Zariah opened it and began to write. She noted the time, the location, the body language, the names. Sharon Whitaker met with Victor Klein. She scribbled, confidential folder, Monroe Capital Partners logo visible. Her handwriting shook, but her focus was razor sharp. She didn't know exactly what the papers contained, but she knew enough. They were passing information, trading secrets, and Zariah had just become the one person in the building who knew the truth. As Victor Klein turned to leave, walking past the teller line with practiced ease, he didn't even glance her way. To him, she was invisible, a child, a nobody. But she wasn't invisible anymore. And she was definitely not a nobody. The lobby had gone oddly quiet. Zariah could hear the faint clicking of keyboards, the soft drone of a copier somewhere down the hall, and the distant shuffling of feet across marble. Yet everything near her felt suspended, still and suffocating. She stood in the same spot, the same shadowed corner of the bank where she'd been told to wait, ignored for what felt like hours. Then movement. Sharon Whitaker emerged from the back, her heels striking the floor with sharper confidence than before. Her eyes skimmed over Zariah briefly. No greeting, no expression, just cold calculation. She murmured something to the security guard nearby, and with no more than a nod, he moved toward Zariah. "You're coming with me," he said in a flat voice, already reaching for her elbow. "Excuse me?" Zariah asked, instinctively pulling her arm back. She wasn't being loud, just firm. "Manager's instructions," he replied without looking her in the eye. "We're taking you to the back office while we continue our verification." Before she could protest, he gently but firmly took her by the arm. The bank was quiet but not silent. People noticed. A few heads turned. Some stared. Others pretended not to see. A few whispered. Zariah's face burned. She tried to keep her head high, but the shame washed over her like a wave. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. This was humiliation, public, deliberate, and dehumanizing. She was being paraded across the bank like a criminal. A 15-year-old girl whose only offense was trying to deposit a scholarship check she had rightfully earned. The guard led her through a short hallway to a small glass-walled room at the back of the branch, just big enough for a table, 2 chairs, and the crushing weight of silence. She was told to sit and wait. He stood by the door, arms folded, his presence a barrier between her and the world outside. She wanted to scream. She wanted to cry. But most of all, she wanted to understand why this was happening, why they had treated her like this. She had done everything right. Then she remembered her notebook. With trembling fingers, Zariah reached into her backpack and pulled it out. She flipped to the same page and began scribbling again. Escorted by security, moved without consent, no explanation, witnesses present. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew this. She would not let this be forgotten. Her breath grew slow and deliberate. Her hands steadied. The fire in her chest no longer felt like shame. It felt like purpose. Back in the lobby, Sharon reappeared behind the counter, smiling at the next customer as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, something ugly, and it was unfolding right there in front of people who chose to look away. Zariah stared out from behind the glass wall, her gaze unwavering. She might have been alone in that moment, but she was no longer small. She was awake, a witness, and more powerful than they knew. The small glass-walled room felt colder now. Zariah's fingers had stiffened from gripping her pen too tightly, and her notebook was starting to fill with fragmented thoughts and quiet fury. Every few minutes, she looked up to see if anyone would come for her. Anyone at all. But the guard stationed at the door hadn't moved, and no one else had even glanced her way. Then finally, the door creaked open. But it wasn't Sharon. It was a young woman, no older than her early 20s, dressed in a modest charcoal blouse and slacks. Her name tag read Kayla Jennings. Her expression was cautious but kind, her eyes flicking to the security guard as if to ask for a moment of privacy. He hesitated, but with a grunt and a glance toward the front, he stepped just outside the room. Kayla stepped in and gently closed the door behind her. "I brought you some water," she said, her voice soft. "Thought you might need it." Zariah accepted the plastic cup with trembling hands. The water was cool, and the act, though simple, was more than anyone else had done for her since she walked through the bank doors that morning. "Thank you," Zariah whispered. Kayla glanced toward the hallway again before stepping closer, lowering her voice to a whisper. "Listen, I probably shouldn't say anything, but I saw what happened out there. It wasn't right. None of this is." Zariah looked up, unsure whether to trust her. But Kayla's eyes held something she hadn't seen in hours: sincerity. "They think you're just a kid," Kayla continued. "But I know who your mom is. I know what this is really about." Zariah's heart skipped. "You do." Kayla nodded, her expression tight. "I overheard Sharon talking to that man, the one in the navy suit, Victor Klein. He's not just a customer. He's the CEO of Eastbridge Holdings. and she gave him something, papers, a folder. It had your mom's company name on it. Zariah felt a chill run through her. So it was true. Everything she'd seen, everything she'd written. It wasn't just suspicion. It was evidence. Kayla leaned closer. She's been working behind the scenes for months, trying to undermine your mother's firm. Leaking files, meeting with competitors. And today she didn't expect anyone to notice, especially not you. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room seemed to pulse with a mix of tension and unspoken courage. Then Kayla added, I don't have any proof yet, but I think your notes, they could matter a lot. Zariah looked down at her notebook, then back at Kayla. For the first time in hours, she didn't feel completely alone. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Kayla's voice wavered. Because I've been in rooms like this. I know how it feels to be watched but never seen, and I didn't speak up then. I won't stay silent now. Outside the room, the world continued turning. But inside, a spark had been lit. Zariah had an ally, and she had something else too. Something even Sharon Whitaker didn't see coming. She had the truth. The front doors of Rockwell First Bank opened with a hushed whoosh of cold morning air, and Dr. Simone Monroe stepped inside. Her entrance was quiet but commanding, the kind of presence that didn't need raised voices or grand gestures. Her tailored navy blue coat fluttered slightly with her stride, and her heels tapped the marble floor in precise rhythm. Purposeful, steady, unmistakable. Heads turned. Conversations paused. Even the air felt different. Simone's eyes swept across the room until they locked on one thing. Her daughter, sitting alone behind a glass wall, guarded like a suspect. Her heart skipped, but her face remained composed. She walked straight toward the front desk, where Sharon Whitaker stood mid-conversation with a customer. Her smile faltered the moment she recognized the woman approaching. Miss Monroe, Sharon began, her voice thin with false charm. We weren't expecting you today. Clearly, Simone cut in smoothly. Where is my daughter? And why is she being held in that room without cause or communication? Sharon opened her mouth to reply, but Simone didn't give her the chance. She stepped past the counter, ignoring the wide-eyed glances from staff and customers alike, and moved toward the private office. The security guard, unsure of protocol in the face of such authority, stepped aside with little more than a nod. Inside the room, Zariah stood up the moment she saw her mother. Her face trembled with a flood of emotions. Relief, frustration, exhaustion, but she held them back. Simone moved to her side, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. I'm okay, Zariah whispered. But there's something you need to see. She opened her leather notebook and handed it over. Simone read, her jaw tightening, eyes darkening as she turned each page. Line after line, Zariah had documented everything. The delay, the discrimination, the confidential folder passed to Victor Klein, the CEO of her mother's top competitor. Simone took a long breath. She turned, walked out of the office, and re-entered the bank lobby like a storm about to break. Sharon Whitaker, she said firmly, her voice echoing in the grand space. You have conspired with a rival CEO to share confidential materials in my bank during business hours, and you've detained my daughter without justification. All eyes turned. Sharon froze. That's ridiculous, she stammered. You have no. I have documentation, Simone said, holding up the notebook, and witnesses. And now I have every reason to call a formal audit and legal counsel. The hush that fell over the lobby was deafening. Sharon's face drained of color. Her mouth opened and closed, but no defense came. Simone turned to the security guard. Please escort Miss Whitaker out of the building, effective immediately. And just like that, the woman who had wielded power with cruelty and prejudice was silently walked out past the girl she had tried to diminish. Simone wrapped an arm around her daughter. For the first time that day, Zariah didn't feel small. She felt seen, heard, and finally safe. The echo of Sharon Whitaker's heels faded as the security guard escorted her out of the bank, leaving behind a stunned silence. No one moved. No one spoke. For a moment, it felt like the building itself was holding its breath. Simone turned back to the remaining staff and customers with the same quiet authority she had entered with. "Let me be clear," she said, her voice firm but calm. "This is not just about my daughter. This is about the way people are treated, with dignity or without it. And what happened here today was unacceptable on every level." A murmur rippled through the lobby. A few employees lowered their eyes. A customer near the front nodded solemnly. The truth, now out in the open, could no longer be ignored. That afternoon, Simone filed an official complaint with the bank's corporate office. But she didn't stop there. She contacted the legal team at Monroe Capital Partners. And by evening, an internal investigation was already underway. The contents of the confidential folder, which Victor Klein had hoped would remain hidden, were quickly traced back to Sharon's office computer. Digital records confirmed the breach, a coordinated effort to sabotage Simone's firm. The fallout was swift. Sharon was permanently dismissed and disqualified from working in the banking industry. Victor Klein's company, Eastbridge Holdings, faced a class action lawsuit for corporate espionage and privacy violations, and the Rockwell First Bank branch underwent a massive leadership restructuring. But the most powerful change didn't come from corporate memos or legal filings. It came from the community and from within the walls of the bank itself. Kayla Jennings, the quiet young employee who had shown Zariah kindness in the darkest moment of her day, was promoted to assistant branch manager. Her actions had demonstrated both courage and integrity, and Simone personally endorsed her advancement. Kayla's first order of business was initiating a bias and equity training program for the entire branch, mandatory for every employee from teller to executive. Meanwhile, Zariah returned to school, not just as a scholarship student, but as someone her peers now saw in a new light. She had stood her ground, documented the truth, and helped take down a system of injustice, all without raising her voice or lowering her head. She was invited to speak at a school assembly where she shared her experience, not as a victim, but as a witness and a warrior for what was right. She spoke not just about discrimination, but about resilience, about having the presence of mind to stay calm, the strength to write things down, and the clarity to act when it mattered most. Simone sat in the front row, beaming with quiet pride. The applause was thunderous. Back at Rockwell First Bank, a new sign was installed near the entrance a few weeks later. It read, "Every customer matters. Every voice is heard." The marble floors still gleamed and the chandeliers still sparkled. But now the institution had a new kind of shine, the kind that only comes from facing the truth and choosing to change. The seasons changed. The leaves outside Zariah Monroe's school turned from summer green to shades of crimson and gold. But what had changed most wasn't the weather. It was her. It had been weeks since the day at Rockwell First Bank. A day that started with a simple goal, depositing a scholarship check. Could have ended in humiliation, in silence, in defeat. But it hadn't. Instead, it became something else entirely. The day a young black girl found her voice and the courage to use it. Zariah walked the halls of her school now with a quieter confidence. Not arrogance, not pride, just a steady awareness of who she was and what she stood for. Teachers looked at her differently. Classmates once unfamiliar now waved in passing or stopped to say hello. They had heard the story, not just the gossip or headlines, but the truth. She hadn't shouted, or stormed out, or demanded attention. She had observed, written, spoken, and when the moment called for it, she acted. Now she was being asked to share that story. At the fall assembly, Zariah stood on stage in front of hundreds of her peers. Her hands didn't shake. Her heart didn't race. She looked out over the crowd, saw faces of every color and age looking back at her, waiting. She spoke calmly, her voice clear and even. "I went to the bank that day thinking I was going to make a deposit, but what I found was something I didn't expect. A reminder that for some of us, being young and black still means being treated like a suspect instead of a student." There was no anger in her tone, only honesty. "I was made to feel invisible, like I didn't belong, but I knew the truth. I had earned that check. I had done the work, and no one, no matter how powerful, was going to take that away from me." She paused, letting the silence settle over the room. I learned that day that the world doesn't always treat people fairly. But I also learned something more important, that standing up doesn't always mean shouting. Sometimes it means writing things down, paying attention, asking questions, and speaking up when it counts. When she finished, the auditorium erupted in applause. Not polite, not obligatory, but real. Later, a group of younger students approached her in the hallway. A girl in the 6th grade said, "You made me feel like I could be brave too." A boy said, "My mom said you're a hero." Zariah didn't think of herself that way. She hadn't set out to be one, but she accepted the praise with the same quiet grace she had shown throughout the ordeal, not letting it swell her head, but letting it strengthen her spirit. Back at Rockwell First Bank, the changes were still unfolding. The walls hadn't changed. The marble floor still gleamed, but the people had. Employees greeted every customer with equal warmth. Diversity training was no longer a checkbox, but a cornerstone. Kayla Jennings now sat in the same office where Sharon Whitaker once ruled and kept a framed quote on her desk that read, "Power is how you treat people when you think no one is watching." One day, Zariah walked past the bank on her way home. She didn't flinch, didn't look away. She paused only for a moment to glance through the glass. No longer a girl waiting in a corner. She was the girl who changed everything. As we reflect on Zariah's story, we're reminded that some of the most powerful moments in life don't involve raised voices or grand speeches. They're made in silence, in courage, and in stillness. This wasn't just the story of a 15-year-old girl depositing a check. It was the story of a young woman walking into a system that didn't expect her to stand tall, and doing just that. For those of us who've lived through decades of social change, from segregation to civil rights marches, from discrimination in plain view to its quieter, more subtle forms, this story rings true. We've seen progress, yes, but we've also seen how bias can still wear a suit and sit behind a desk, can smile at one person and scorn the next, can operate silently in places where power goes unchecked. And yet, this story gives us hope, because Zariah didn't scream. She didn't crumble. She chose to observe, to document, and to act with wisdom far beyond her years. She reminded us that truth doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers through the pen of someone who refuses to be silenced. For older adults watching, there's a powerful parallel here. We've been the truth tellers, the witnesses, the fighters in our own time. We've spoken up in courtrooms, in churches, in factories, and at family dinner tables. And now we see a new generation picking up the torch. What Zariah did with grace and grit echoes the strength we've seen across decades. Her notebook might as well have been a baton passed from the hands of those who've lived through injustice to those ready to keep challenging it. So what can we take from this story into our lives today? We can remember that small actions still matter. That silence in the face of wrongdoing is never neutral. That whether we're 15 or 85, our influence carries weight in our words and our votes, in the way we show up for others. And most of all, that we should never underestimate the power of simply paying attention and telling the truth. Zariah's experience didn't just change her bank. It opened eyes. It reminded a community of what dignity looks like. And in doing so, it left a ripple, one that's still spreading. If the story spoke to you, press 7 in the comments. If you believe more people need to hear it, share this video with a friend or loved one. And stay tuned to our channel for more stories like this. True stories that inspire, challenge, and bring light into today's world. Because when we listen, when we remember, and when we pass the story on, change continues.